which is a nice segue into our next topic. And Russ, this was a topic you wanted to talk about. And I know you've brought up a couple of times earlier in the previous season when we talked about Ukraine. And so you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the possibilities of maybe nuclear activity with regard to Ukraine. And so, thinking about these apocalyptic bunkers, it just reminded me of how Robert Heinlein, the author, had built his own underground bunker. He even wrote some short stories in a book centered in a bunker because that was a big obsession of folks in the 50s as they worried about nuclear fallout from the Cold War. And he had built all these elaborate systems to exchange air and to filter water, and he was out in the Southwest. So he built his own bunker, and previous people who have owned the house didn't know the bunker was underneath it. So it just got, so it's a nice segue into thinking how we used to, as a country, be fascinated with how to survive a nuclear exchange or a nuclear confrontation. So I want to hand it over to you, Russ, because you want to talk a little bit about how the message is shaped with regard to Ukraine and the threat of nuclear activity by Russia.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk off the cuff here. I didn't prepare any articles to cite or anything like that, but just
And
my
that's fine.
general
I did a
impressions.
general brush up myself just to make sure I knew
No
where we
problem.
were with it.
But I've become more and more increasingly concerned with the drums of war being beaten by the war hawks on both sides of the aisle, saying we have to beat Russia, we have to protect Ukraine, and talking about thinking that limited nuclear exchange with Russia could be a possibility, but in no way, trying to mitigate that. I, I, we all grew up under the threat of Cold War and nuclear annihilation at any time, and mutually assured destruction was, I mean,
that was the phrase
that's
we
what
heard.
prevented us
Yeah.
from getting. Yeah, I mean, we didn't get into direct conflicts with Russia. I mean, we would have each country would have our proxy wars around the globe, Vietnam and Korea and whatnot. But open nuclear conflict with Russia was something that everyone wanted to avoid. And these days, we've got people who don't seem to remember what can happen in nuclear war when they're talking about we need to defeat Putin. Basically acting like he's just another Muammar Gaddafi that we can dispense with.
Oh, true.
And it's like, what do you think somebody who has that the largest nuclear arsenal in the world is backed into a corner, and he can either be impaled on the streets like Gaddafi, or is he going to press the button and say, well, fuck it, I'm going to take everyone with me? I mean, we could be in that sort of situation ultimately, and we just need. I just feel like we need to have cooler heads prevailing in this arena. It just gets me worried. And when I see articles, I mean, it was probably an op-ed. I believe it was in the New York Magazine or Atlantic or something, and the headline was, "Would limited nuclear war be good for climate change?" I mean,
Man,
ridiculous stuff
that's
like that.
a National Review article from the late 70s, early 80s. That's where you would have read something about that. Where does it make sense to do that? That's weird. Yeah.
Right. But this was something more recent than that. But
Oh yeah.
I just I just don't understand why we're openly talking about this, and people are beating the drum, wanting to send in American troops, into Ukraine, and I'm a little concerned about it. I don't know what y'all's thoughts
Well,
on
I
it
think
are.
the thing that we have to remember is that at the fall of the U.S., the Soviet Union, a lot of the nukes went missing. Uh, this current status of them, I know that Clyde in previous seasons, when we were talking about this, is that within the Russian military there was a lot of fabricated reports. So just how ready some of those missiles are is unknown, or whether or not they're even stable, or whether or not they even still exist. A lot is unknown, and while things being unknown is kind of what protected us in the past, is not knowing. I think really the scarier thing here is they might in good faith not intend to do anything, but it doesn't mean that something of a Russian nature couldn't be used to create some sort of nuclear incident. I'm honestly surprised that it hasn't happened up until now. So we've either been extraordinarily lucky, or maybe they aren't as insecure in Russia. The nuclear weapons are not as unsecured as we worry that they are. What we have to be curious about is, do either of you know what it takes in Russia to launch their nukes? Like here, we know there are two keys. We know he carries the nuclear football. Do we know how it works
It's
over there?
similar.
Okay.
It's similar. They have their, I guess they have their procedures, their bureaucracy, and he can't press a button just like our president can't press a button. It does have to go through generals and staff and things like that. And there's a lot of opportunity for people to, quote, do the right thing. And we have people in Putin's inner circle. We absolutely do. And I know that from the intelligence reports that come out that talk about personal conversations that we know Putin has in his compound up in the Ural Mountains. So if we got people there, we got people fully integrated from an intelligence standpoint, I would like to think that we are keeping tabs on the nuclear question to such a degree that we are trying to recruit people inside the Kremlin, certain generals, certain people that, hey, look, if you were to accidentally shoot Putin about 12 times in the back of the head, America would be totally cool with you being a caretaker for the government until new elections. Like I believe that we've got that set up, and I believe that Putin knows that because, fundamentally from a cultural perspective, the Russian people and the American people, not that different. You watch Russian social media versus our social media, and even Iranian social media, you'd be hard pressed to find much of a difference in the way people act and things like that. It's just, it's not an alien culture. I think they have as many people over there that are petrified, just like we are. And I think that we have just as much chance to prevent a nuclear event by engaging with moderate, intelligent people within the Kremlin and actually just do some good old-fashioned regime change in order to prevent. Because look, the people who call for nuclear strikes are the pundits, the people on TV, the people who have made a career out of it, because for them it's safe. I can just spout off and say all sorts of shit because next week it'll be something different. It'll be the gays. It'll be trans. It'll be whatever. But they don't care what effect it has. So I was afraid, but I'm no longer afraid, only because I think a lot of people. Russia right now is in a bad state.
Well, I don't believe anything that the CIA is reporting, and I also. There was one other point I was going to make, and it has just escaped me.
Well, but you're right, and we should always have healthy skepticism of definitely.
Oh,
the CIA.
I remember now.
Okay, go for it.
When is the last time our regime change strategy worked out?
Oh yeah, never. I can't imagine that it's ever.
Yeah, I don't put any faith in that at all.
As far as you know, it may have worked out exactly the way they intended it.
Oh, so like we won't know if time has been changed because, yeah, it's all seamless.
Yeah, leaving every country where we attempted regime change in a much worse state. That sounds like a great strategy for world peace. Yeah. But anyway,
well,
I think that
nuclear war. I would.
So,
well, but
what are your thoughts on on a diplomatic solution where we are now,
Well,
rather than continue with the protracted war.
the only thing we can really do is, I mean, we've got the credibility to step in as a moderator, and we should try to serve that role because it will help. It'll help in the image of the U.S. It is a good diplomatic move. We would be foolish to allow China to step in and negotiate that from a diplomatic standpoint because it will give them legitimacy in the area. But it's also happening closer to China, so shouldn't China be engaged anyway? In the end, China is walking a very interesting line between all of this. Putin, I think, will find his point of stability, where what he deals with and how he is approaching this. Like right now, they're pulling out of certain regions. I think they're going to find a particular line where they can do an honorable enough end to the activities because he's got almost no army left. He's backed into a corner economically. He needs to recover a little bit if he wants to make sure he doesn't get assassinated by either the CIA or any covert American business, or
people in Ukraine
exactly
are attempting.
That's what I mean, or people that have a stake in the game. We always like to talk about no, these Middle Eastern countries need to overthrow their own governments, and everybody should. If you're going to overthrow your own government and set something up new, it should be done by you and not external forces. So we shouldn't be part of that at all. That's not our job in the world. But if we are asked to help, oftentimes that is what we do, is we do help and we don't shy away from.
I don't know how we would have any credibility in this arena in fostering diplomatic a solution because we're the ones funding the fucking war almost exclusively.
Not necessarily. You gotta remember this is Europe, and we are
true. Europe
funding,
has contributed a lot, but through NATO. A lot of this is being provided through NATO.
Let me give this perspective, which is Russia has always, forever, used the tactic of go in, shock and awe, destroy, make it so brutal that people sue for peace just for the killing to stop. Right. That's been a tactic for at least a century, and they go in and they eliminate entire populations of people, and that's what they did with Ukraine. But it didn't work this time. It didn't work because we gave Ukraine the weapons. We also trained Ukraine because they did not have an army, a military that would even be able to do this without us training them. Now, I'm completely behind that because for the past 30 years, Russia has dictated basically the power structures throughout Europe with the use of natural gas. Russia is enormously wealthy when it comes to natural resources, oil, natural gas. They got ass loads of it. None of it gets to the Russian people who outside of Moscow live in villages that don't even have sewage. But the Russia has always played the, hey, you better play with us because we got the biggest army and all the nukes. And Russia, of course, has its own regime change issues like we do. And you know what? I think that entire continent and the world is tired of one country that can actually threaten through war global food supply chain issues.
Do you mean because of their proximity to each other? Because like over here, we're isolated. Are you talking because they're like next door neighbors to Europe?
What I'm talking about is allowing Russia or anyone we're a global society now because it takes a global society to feed this many people. And they're with one country threatening famine for countries all over the world that have nothing to do with this, strictly because they want that country. At some point, you have to say, why should I negotiate with someone who has kicked in my front door, moved into my kitchen, killed the dog and grandma and everyone, and then tells me, well, let's sit at the negotiating table and let's talk about it. No, you're in my fucking kitchen. What are you doing? That's and and that's what they've been doing for decades. They did it with Georgia, not our Georgia, their Georgia. They did it with Chechnya. They did it with Ukraine, and they did it with Crimea. And that's what they've always done. And it's different now because we're tired of the bullshit. And now we've learned, wait a minute, your army is shit. You've been threatening us with an army that doesn't even have working tanks that are modern. They're all from the 60s. I watched footage of Ukrainians finding 80-year-old weapons and vehicles that had been distributed to these conscripts. And don't forget, they have a different system. It is heartbreaking that all the people that are dying in Russia on the Russian side, just people like us that are forced to do a year of service. It's a contract, and they'll get a week of training at that, and they're sent to die. And it's like, they are saying no. They are now stopping. They're like, no, I'm tired of dying. We're all tired of dying. These are just regular people. And that's what the world is finally realizing, which is, why are we letting Russia control the global food supply and allowing them to just invade anyone and give it to them? We messed up. This is our mess. We messed up by letting Russia do what it did in Crimea and Georgia and Chechnya, and letting him take
You don't think
countries.
that any of this, what's going on in Ukraine, had anything to do with us trying to pressure Ukraine to become part of NATO?
No, because we can pressure all day long. First of all, they made a promise that they wouldn't join NATO. The idea that Russia is doing this because Ukraine threatened to join NATO is a natural Russian talking point. You don't invade and try to take a country because you're afraid that NATO is going to invade you and take over, considering now that he's invaded and murdered and butchered tens of thousands of people. He's now made it worse, and 2 more countries that border Russia are entering NATO, countries that promised they would never join
Well,
NATO in order to keep.
that sounds an
Whoa.
awful lot like what we did in the Middle East. We went over and did a few things which just made a lot of the smaller countries band together, and in the end, it
Yeah,
doesn't.
Ultimate Streisand.
Yeah.
I'm sure we don't really know what's going on, but to just write it off as, oh, that's just a Russian talking point. I
No,
think
it
that's
is.
I think
It
that's
is.
I think that's a load of shit, and I think that
I think
it's
the comment
probably
is a
the
load of
truth is
shit.
probably somewhere. The truth is
I,
probably somewhere in the middle.
I don't believe for 1 second that the reason Putin invaded Ukraine was because we pressured Ukraine to enter NATO. This is a
I didn't say
man
that was the
who
only
has
reason.
No, I wouldn't think that was
no,
the
but
only reason. But
I certainly would never believe that it's a reason, because he goes and this is what he does. He goes into countries and takes them.
but
He's
it
very clear
but it
about
may be
So
why he
it's our
takes
job
them.
to be the world police, and then there's a
Well,
bad
that's
guy,
what
and we're going to
everyone
go kill him.
always says.
And guess what? I can tell you this without a doubt. In retrospect, what we never should have invaded Iraq, because it's
Oh,
only destabilized the region
I agree.
completely. And even though he's a shithead, and
Mhm.
not no love lost, I think that was an absolutely huge mistake. And if we try to do the same thing with Russia and do a regime change there, if we happen to get out without causing nuclear conflict, it would be a huge mistake. And then that would leave a huge vacuum for China to come right in.
All right.
Right?
Well, I agree. And if we want to expand this out to a longer topic, but we want to leave a little bit of room for our final topic, which is hopefully a little bit lighter. We're a little bit over an hour at this point, but
Oh, yeah.
we actually are. And I do want to make one final point, is that I see I see what each one of you are saying, and each part of that, I agree. We don't know enough of what's going on, and we can't take at face value what is being said by either party, because we all know what's really going on is just that world chess that normally goes on. And sometimes we help because we're asked, and sometimes we help when nobody asks because we've got ulterior motives. And hopefully, as this continues to play out, we'll revisit the topic here and see if it turns out we were right. And hopefully, it won't be a nuclear annihilation, and then we can never say, I told you so.